Greetings, dear listeners. Israel and Iran are at war. This conflict will determine the future of the Middle East and possibly the world. The time is fitting, then, to release our conversation with Abbas Milani, professor of political science and Iran studies at Stanford University. Professor Milani is a world-renowned authority on Iranian history, having published the book Lost Wisdom, Rethinking Modernity in Iran, and Mohamed Reza Pahvalvi, The Shah, the definitive biography of the last Shah of Iran. He joined us this past December to discuss Iran, secularism, and the future. What do Iranians think about the West? What would a democratic Iran look like? Is there a way to reconcile religious devotion and democracy? Is modernity exclusively a Western phenomenon, or is there an Iranian version of modernity? Before we get started, a reminder to head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and consider becoming a paid subscriber if you're not one yet. You'll get access to, among other things, the whole conversation with Abbas Milani, along with other subscriber-only benefits. And don't forget to give us a like and review on your favorite podcast app. With all that out of the way, on to the show.
So maybe just to get us started for the layperson who hasn't maybe been following Iranian politics that closely, and I think that the domestic side of it is more perhaps interesting and relevant here. We're always obsessed with Iran's nefarious role in the region and its proxies and allies, Hezbollah and so forth. But I think we don't always pay attention to the internal dynamics in the country. So how would you maybe describe the general state of play? How weak is the regime? How strong is the regime? Is it somewhere in between?
I first of all think that that is a very important point about the way Iran is covered. Iran is covered essentially through its nefarious activities in the region, uh, and oftentimes by views offered in Washington, offered as a very powerful uh, superpower almost. Somebody actually talked about Iran as a regional superpower. But if you pay attention to the domestic situation, I think you will come away thinking that this is a giant with a feet of clay, that
Mhm.
this is indeed a very vulnerable regime. Uh, Not as vulnerable as some in the opposition, Iranian opposition think, which is the common predilection of diasporas. They think they're on the next train back or the next plane back. Uh, the regime, I think, is very vulnerable. It is now at its most vulnerable, but still has more staying power than some in the opposition think.
And I think this is a concern that I have because I've been hearing some version of the Iranian regime is on its last legs. It's about to fall. It's so inherently weak that it can't help but collapse based on its own contradictions, that sort of thing. And I'm sure you've been hearing that for a
Mhm.
very long time as well. So that would suggest to me that as vulnerable as the regime is, as weak as it might seem, it still has a solid enough base of support among a kind of hardcore rank and file and key figures in the regime, and enough unity in the regime coalition that even if a growing number of people hate the regime, it can still sustain itself through the use of force and coercion. How would you respond to that?
I would partially disagree with it and partially agree with it. I would disagree with it in the sense that I think the base of support is not solid, it's fragile. I think there is dissension within the ranks of the regime. It no longer has the unity of purpose, unity of violence that it once did. But it still has more than some in the opposition think. The regime, in order to collapse, has to have, first of all, a profound sense of disunity. It has to have lost its ability to exercise violence, both in terms of its will and its exercise. The regime just gave away $77 million, according to Hezbollah sources, in the last week to rebuild houses in Lebanon for Hezbollah families. So it still has some ability to project power outside. It has a lot of ability to project force inside, but it also is fragile in the sense that it is facing an essentially disobedient, disgruntled, and determined opposition domestically, led by Iranian women, led by Iranian youth, who want to live a normal life, who want to live a modern life, who want to live in a secular Iran, who want to live in Iran where sovereign interest rather than ideological interest drive foreign policy. So that incongruence to me, and that corruption and that nepotism are what underscores the fragility of this regime. What helps support it, uh, what helps sustain it, is that it still has some 10, 15, 20% of the population that is willing to go along with it. It has international players who are more or less willing to support it. China more or less supporting it. Russia more or less supporting it. And it doesn't have a cohesive, unified opposition inside and outside together that can offer an alternative that would then, I think, uh, bring the end
So,
to the regime.
so you use two very interesting words, modern and secular, in describing what a growing number of young Iranians want as an alternative. And, we're a podcast that's interested in first principles, so we have a lot of debates and discussions about liberalism and the fact that liberalism, at least in the West, seems to be weaker, that there is a kind of loss of faith and a kind of sometimes a fantasizing about post-liberal or
Mm-hmm.
illiberal alternatives. And what you're saying here is that young Iranians want precisely what we have. But I do want to just introduce a note of caution because I think that anyone who's been on Twitter will see the memes, if I can call them that, where people look back to Iran in the 50s and 60s and they'll have pictures of Iranian women in miniskirts, and there's a kind of idealization of, oh, if only the Middle East could go back to the way it was before Islamism, before Islam started playing more of a role in public life, and then they could be just like us, Western, English speaking, liberal, dressing like us, looking like us, and so forth. How should we kind of situate ourselves in relation to these ideas and these idealizations?
Again, I think part of this idealized image is reality, and part of it is figment of imagination, Western Eurocentric imagination. Uh, it's real because I think of all the countries in the Middle East, I know of no country where the people at the core level want a secular society. I think Iran is more secularized than Turkey is, for example. I think so. It's by far more secularized than any of the Persian Gulf states are, or Morocco is, or Lebanon is, because people have decided that Islam, political Islam, does not have a solution to their problem. It does not solve the problem. They want, in a historic sense, they want a modernity. They want an Iranian modernity, not a Western modernity. They don't want to emulate everything Western. But they don't see themselves. Again, you see this in films, you see this in literature, you see this in writing that comes out of Iran. You see it with the way people vote with their feet. Where do people leave Iran to? They don't go to China. They don't. They go to Turkey because they have no other place. It's the only place that gives them a visa. If they have a place to go, if they have a choice, they come to US, Canada, Europe. Uh, and they don't, I think, have an idealized image of what West is like. What they, I think, want is truly a modern state in the sense that people are sovereign. They don't want the sovereignty of Allah. The sovereignty of Allah means the elimination of popular sovereignty. The Iranian people have seen with their own experience how you cannot have an Islamic democracy, as you cannot have a Jewish democracy, as you cannot have a Christian democracy. Democracy is the will of the people, regardless of their faith. Democracy is acceptance of ambiguity in human condition. When you attach it to Jewish democracy, Buddhist democracy, Islamic democracy, you take out the ambiguity. And absent ambiguity, you can't have democracy. And I think the Iranian people have recognized as a 44 years result of the effort to push down a very limited interpretation of Sharia. The Iranian version of Sharia that this regime has been uh, ramming down the throat of the people is a minority Shiite view, which is itself a minority view amongst the Muslim world.
Santi.
So, what I find fascinating about your thought, Professor, is that you're one of the few people that has a simultaneous appreciation of the good and the bad of the West in relation to a country that's outside the West. And for example, even when you spoke just now about an Iranian modernity, I'm curious how you define an Iranian modernity, because the idea of modernity that's kind of in the conversation, the sort of vulgar idea of modernity, is just roughly speaking Americanization, right? The
Yeah,
expansion of consumer markets and
yeah.
democracy in a very brute sense. So, what would an Iranian modernity look like?
I think that's an excellent question. This is not a vulgar view, actually. This is a view, again, I can only speak about Iran, and I'm only speaking about Iran. Professor Hamid can talk about other places, but you can talk about other places. I talk about Iran. Two groups of people have articulated the view you call the vulgar view of modernity. One are those who are in love with the West, want to turn Iran into a West. They want to dress like Mike, smell like Mike, look like Mike. Uh, the other one who has said the same thing are the clergy. And that the part of the clergy who are enemies of modernity. They say modernity means looking like the West. Modernity means losing our faith. Modernity means our woman becoming subject of the lust of man. There is a third path that says, first of all, modernity isn't Western. The notion that modernity is a creation of the West, it's itself a Eurocentric, almost colonial view of modernity. There was modernity in Iran. There was Abyssinia in Iran. There was Khayyam in Iran. There was humanism in Iran 300 years before there was Renaissance. A lot of mathematics for the theory of perspective in painting comes to Florence from Baghdad. There's a whole book about that. So this notion that modernity is Western has been given to us by these Westophiles, these lovers of the West, and by these Islamists who are enemies of the West, from Sayyid Qutb to Khamenei. There are Muslims who say, no, Islam is a matter of faith, is a matter of spirituality, and we need to learn from the West, and we need to retain our own uh, um identity. In other words, there is a third path, having an Iranian global modernity. I think what MBS is trying to do, with all kinds of difficulties, is creating a Arabic global modernity. He's trying to do it with music, with sports, with a new city. Iran is doing it with something else, has been doing it with something else. For 120 years, this process has been going on.
But can you say a little bit more about that? What this third path looks like, what this global modernity looks like? Because
That
what MBS is doing is not very attractive to many people.
Of course, because
it's just buying a
yes,
lot of
I
European
said it
soccer
has
players.
difficulties. It's trying to do it with music. It's trying to do it with sports. Clearly, these point to a problem. But because the past that he can rely on, modernity really means rebirth. Modernity means finding something in your own culture that can be sustained and used and reinvented for a modern democratic society where religions are equal, where men and women are equal, where there is ambiguity, when science is accepted. In Iran, we have this tradition. In Iran, we have Khayyam, who 800 years ago promotes a kind of a profound atomistic view of the world. We have Ferdowsi, we have Avicenna, we have someone 800, 900 years ago who says Quran is an invention of a human being. God hasn't spoken. Razi has almost verbatim said what today in Iran, if you say, they hang you on the wall. So if the Iranian modernity is one that learns from the West, knows the West has much to teach it, but knows that you cannot emulate the West. You shouldn't go the path of Ataturk, say we have to look like the West, change our alphabet, change our clothes, change our calendar. We have a language of our own. We have an architecture of our own. But we also need to learn the architecture of the world.
But
We need,
is secularism something that is Western that you don't need to adopt, like dress, or is it something that's universal?
I think secularism is absolutely universal. The notion that secularism is alien to Iran, even, to me, uh,
Okay,
doesn't
but
speak
what do
to
we
the
mean by secularism here? The separation of church and state, religion and the state, or
absolute,
thoroughgoing
just the
skepticism
separation.
about religion?
No, separation in the Iranian traditional sense, it means the separation of the institution of the church, mosque, from the state. The state is in the power of uh, the uh, uh, the king, sultan, and the problems of spirituality are in the hands of this. And then within Iran, there are different periods where the clergy make an effort to claim that sovereign spiritual side to the political side. In the last 150 years, that's the big battle in Iran. Iranians today say, look, your faith is your a private matter. You can believe whatever you want in private. I'll protect your right in a Jeffersonian sense, but you don't have the right to tell me how to dress. You could say this is Western, but I say this notion that the idea that you shouldn't uh, take Islam, for example, to be a hegemonic faith is not a Western idea. You find it in Rumi. Rumi says, who the hell are you to Muslims? Who says, who the hell are you to tell a Christian or a Buddhist that you're better? Sadi says in his great book, Sadi says, where do you Muslims get the right that you're better than others? You have a faith, they have a faith. That's what secularism means.
But isn't the concern here then that we're associating modernization with the privatization of religion, and that's what makes religious people, and not just Muslims, but also religious Christians in the US, nervous because they see secularization as a negative process because it sort of aspires to neutrality. It talks in a language of neutrality, but ultimately it leads to the marginalization of faith where you tell people, oh, you can believe in whatever you want, but keep it to yourself. Don't bring your faith into the public sphere. But I think many Muslims would say that to be Muslim for them is to have public commitments that are relevant to politics, that they want to be able to express their full selves in the public sphere without cutting themselves off, so to speak. And I
Uh,
think that even, the example of, a philosopher who said that the Quran was invented by human beings, that I think would also make folks nervous that in moving towards modernization, you have ideas that I think it's fair to say were very much a minority view. And, in the pre-modern period, Islam did play a prominent role. It was imbued in everyday aspects of public life. And now, so how would you respond to those concerns? Because modernization, great, but I think that there's a risk of alienating people when we associate modernization with secularization because they don't want to see their religion privatized.
Well, first of all, to me, modernity means that religion is privatized. Modernity and democracy cannot exist without religion being a private domain. What the big lie of the Islamist is, and but the big lie of the Islamic Republic is, what the big lie of Sayyid Qutb and people like him is the notion that if you allow religion to be private, then you've lost your faith. That's the first step towards heresy. That's what, but that's not limited to Islam. That's very much a notion that was very alive and uh, unwell or well in West after the rise of secularism, the rise of counter-reformation, the rise in 19th century of a strong strain of Jewish fundamentalism against the idea of secularizing Judaism. In Christianity, uh, in 19th century and 20th century, as you point today, saying that unless we have church in state, we are on the road to perdition. So it's not just the Muslims, but in Iran, I think, uh, today, we're talking about Iran today, I think there are polls. I'm not just talking about guessing. A great majority of the people in Iran say religion should be private. Not that there shouldn't be religion. There should be religion. Uh, in democracy, you can't interfere in people's private spirituality. But if you believe to say, I'm going to force my faith on you, the result is absolutely, unavoidably, inevitably a form of despotism.
But presumably there's a middle ground between religion being private and people forcing their religion through coercion
This
in
is
the
the,
public sphere. There's gray areas of the in between, I think. And maybe just to bring up an example, like let's say we have democracy in a Muslim majority context, and you have a party that wants Islam to play a central role in public life. It would be very hard to restrict that unless you had something in the constitution that basically mandated secularism. But even Turkey has that, but yet Islamist parties have come to power. If that is ultimately what a plurality or a majority of people want, and they want to express that, and they want to use their freedom to call for that in public life, then we have a bit of a dilemma here, right? And because while I take your point that right now in Iran, a majority want religion to be privatized, that wasn't the case in 1979 or 1981. There did seem to be a majority of Iranians who wanted more Islam in public life, and that's part of the reason of why the Islamic Revolution succeeded, because people had become disillusioned with secularism. So isn't it possible to imagine, let's say there's a secular revolution in Iran next year, but then people become disillusioned with secularism again, and in 10 or 15 years, there's more of a call for religion to come back. I mean, these things move in cycles and in pendulum, the shift of the pendulum here. So how would you, isn't that a possible future for Iran, that you have secularism, but then at some later point people want Islam back?
Well, there are many aspects of what you said that I would want to discuss. First of all, I don't agree with the proposition that the reason the Iranian Revolution happened was because people wanted more religion. Absolutely not. Uh, um, it ended up that way because the institutions of religion were allowed to grow uh, at the cost of every other democratic alternative. The only force that was allowed to have schools, fundraising, endowments, publishing houses, magazines, everything were the Islamists, because the Shah believed the main danger was communism and that the Islamists will help in the fight against communism. The mistake the Shah make is the mistake that the United States made in Afghanistan. It's the mistake Israel made in Lebanon. It's the mistake Israel made in Gaza, thinking that strengthening an Islamic force will undermine Palestinian nationalism. It undermines Palestinian nationalism, but it creates a greater problem for democracy. So the notion, Khomeini gave 120 interviews in the month before, from October to February, when he returned to Iran. He doesn't mention once the word Velayat Faqih. What he offers is a liberal democracy. He says our constitution, actually the first draft of the constitution is a translation of the Fifth Republic. That ain't Islamic. Khomeini actually signs that. He comes to Iran. He realizes the weakness of the liberal Democrats. He realizes the profound network that he has himself. He has created, the Islamists have created, and decides to go for his maximum program, which is Velayat Faqih.
Can
But
I?
but Khomeini's views well before that. I mean, his treatise that he wrote in 1970, translated as Islamic Government, where he lays out his vision of an
Mhm.
Islamically infused state apparatus. He had that famous quote: "The preservation of Islam is even more important than prayer." Things that are so extreme as to be almost heretical, and his obsession with the purifying the state. We do see echoes of that in some of his earlier work. Now, maybe he wasn't emphasizing that in his interviews before when he was in France in exile, but still he had a record of being an Islamist.
He had a
For those
record.
who, yeah,
No, absolutely. But first of all, that book was banned in Iran, remarkably. If I was the Shah, I would make that book mandatory reading for every high school and college in Iran. Really, you're absolutely right. You read that book. I read it actually when it was first published. Uh, I was a TA at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and my professor was Hamid. I'm sure you know him. He was an early follower of Khomeini, and he gave me the book. I read the book in Berkeley in 70, and I thought, this is a joke. This can't happen in Iran. So he was very clear about what he wanted, but no one believed him. The liberal Democrats didn't believe him. The left didn't believe him. The Savak didn't believe him. Because again, I think, our attention on political Islam today might blind us to how Islam was viewed in 60s and 70s, how the West, I'm sure you might have seen it, I certainly have seen it, Kissinger writing to Egypt saying, you got to bring back Muslim Brotherhood if you're going to throw out the Soviets. That's the view they had, the West had of Islam. And Khomeini very cleverly published a book, very honestly published a book, but very cleverly made no mention of it. But then when he came to power, absolutely, that became the model. And from the moment it became the model, the Iranian people realized that they have made a deal they didn't really know the details of. They tried to renegotiate the contract. And that's 44 years of insecurity.
Can I intervene here and bring it a little bit back to philosophy and less to the history of Iran, and say something in defense of Abbas here? Shadi, I think when you're trying to reconcile a different form of secularism with modernity, you have the bigger challenge here, because I mean, religion depends on a revelation, right? A revelation from God to man. If God is speaking to man, that message should dominate everything, culturally and politically, right? And modernity's achievement, according to many, is precisely to liberate humanity from the domination of one message from God. So in that regard, I understand why Abbas is saying to be modern means to privatize religion. It means to not let that domination happen. But I think the dilemma here is, and I think as a religious believer, you might believe that the revelation is true, but as a Democrat, small d Democrat, you also want democracy to be the norm. So reconciling those two things is not easy, and I think it's one of the key questions of our time, right? Because that's part of what I find Professor Milani's thought interesting is precisely that there has to be this third way beyond just Western homogenization and Islamism, right? But
May I
that
say
third
something?
way, I
Yeah.
think, Shadi, you're in a position to define that third way, but it's not easy.
If I may say, Mr. Hamid, I'll get you. Uh, it's not just privatizing religion in the face of revelation. It is understanding the equal, at least the equal value of human reason next to revelation as a source of salvation. And that's what modernity does. And we have a thinker in Iran. You can think, Avicenna. He says, literally 1,000 years ago, he says, reason must be equal to revelation. And if there is something in revelation that doesn't fit with reason, don't overthrow reason. Wait till you find a way to reconcile it. Modernity comes essentially to say, human reason, I think, therefore I am. Not I believe, therefore I am. Islam says, I believe, therefore I am.
Well,
Modernity says, I think, therefore
the
I am.
problem is that there's versions of modernity that don't wait for for religion to catch up with reason, that they
Absolutely.
exclude religion. And
Absolutely.
you said something interesting about the ambiguity, human ambiguity as being essential to democracy. There's a way that sort of Western secularism also loses touch with ambiguity, that they have a totalizing doctrine. So, like somebody like Richard Dawkins, I think, doesn't know about the ambiguity of human experience either, and about mystery of human experience.
The whole school of empiricism, positivism, uh, Karl Marx, they don't understand this notion of ambiguity. They don't understand the notion of, the ineffable nature of human beings.
Mhm.
That's why the romantics rise up against the rationalism, the sort of crude mechanical rationalism of some of the people you're talking about. The age that put God on trial. They say, forget about God. You can't put God on trial. Uh, I translated the 3 volumes of Kolakowski's book, Main Currents of Marxism, into Farsi. And Kolakowski famously says, he says, that's where modernity went wrong. They didn't understand that you can't joke with this aspect of spirituality.
So, are you worried though that Iran could just go in the other extreme and become a very like rationalist Voltairean state? I mean, it seems like not the main problem right now, obviously. But
Uh, And I don't. Again, I go back to what Professor Hamid said. He said that there's a cyclical pattern to history. I don't believe in the cyclical pattern of history. I am an incorrigible modernist. I believe in the idea of progress. I believe that there is human progress. The book, The Promise of Enlightenment, shows this that with empirical evidence that almost everything modernity has promised, sooner or later, it has delivered. So there is a progression. It's a dialectical progression. Sometimes we fall back. Germany was on a progressive path. Hitler came, it was a radical step backward from Weimar. But it eventually caught up. I'm not worried about that in Iran.
Yeah, but, I mean, one concern is that the idea of progress is unfalsifiable because you can always say that the progress is still to come. Because I would point to Arab countries where there was a profound secularization in the first half of the 20th century, but then that was overtaken by Islamization, and there hasn't been this progress in a secular direction, at least in most of these Arab countries. But I do want to go back to I want to maybe problematize the idea that revelation and reason are in conflict with each other. I think that if you look at pre-modern Islamic history, there is a richness and diversity there where reason and revelation both play a role in defining what Islamic law looks like. And we do see incredible innovation and scientific and medical advancement under a hegemonic Islamic system. So even when Sharia is dominant, we do see the richness that you're pointing to. So I just don't want us to come out with this idea that when Islam is hegemonic, it tramples on progress
When
or it.
Islam is hegemonic, if Islam is politically hegemonic, as if Christianity, I don't want to pick on Islam, if any religion is hegemonic, that impedes progress because religion does not tolerate ambiguity.
No, but is that true? That's what I want to question. The claim that religion doesn't tolerate ambiguity. I think
I can
many
talk
of.
about Iran. I can only talk about Iran. The times where, first of all, to say that Iran is an Islamic state, that thus Sharia is always dominant, that's not true. That's simply not true. Uh, Sharia has been dominant in Iran. Iran has been a profoundly wine drinking culture, a profoundly dancing culture, a profoundly painting culture, a profoundly musical culture, a profoundly sculpting culture. The Sharia folks have said these are all bad. Theater is bad.
But
Sculpting is bad. Uh, Image making is bad. You can't
but
usurp the.
wasn't
But
wasn't Islam? I mean, I'm not an expert here. But I'm a Hispanic Catholic, but from what I understand, the golden age of Islam took place in a time when Islam had hegemony over a large part of the world, right?
Islam
Isn't
had
that
hegemony over parts of the world, but the kind of Islam that had hegemony were not the kind of Islam. There were Islamic societies, but Sharia wasn't hegemonic.
so?
That
That was a
drinking
religion.
wasn't banned.
So that was a religion, though, that accepted the sort of ambiguity of the human condition and the questions, and it was
That
open
shows
to
that there are
investigation.
versions of Islam that do tolerate ambiguity. So it's not so much that religion is the problem, it's what kind of religion.
Yes, what kind of religion? Any kind of religion that wants to make, again, because I don't want to sound like I'm singling out Islam. Uh, Buddhism, Zen. If Zen says tomorrow, I'm going to be the religion of America and I'm going to rule by Zen rules, you're going to have a despotic society. What if I don't want to live by Zen? What about if I want to be a Muslim? You cannot, in Islamic society today, almost all of them cannot accept the Baha'is as a faith. Who are they to determine whether a Baha'i has the right to his private faith or not?
Yeah, but it's also the case that secular or relatively secular Arab states are also intolerant of Baha'is. I mean, I'm thinking here about Egypt. Egypt under Sisi or previously under Mubarak was anti-Islamist. It was more secular leaning. But there is a kind of logic of the modern nation state that itself isn't always tolerating diversity. Again, so secularism can be intolerant in this regard, right?
Again, I can only speak
Yeah, yeah.
a little bit knowledgeably about Iran. Uh, During the Pahlavi era, which was the golden era for religious minorities in Iran, Jewish, Christians, Zoroastrians, uh, Baha'is had the golden age, but there was persecution against them because religious Islamic forces would systematically, I can tell you this about the Pahlavi era, about which I know probably better than other periods of Iranian history. It was the Islamists who were forcing the Shah to go against the Baha'is. The Shah, his private physician was a Baha'i. Some of his most trusted people were Baha'i, but he didn't dare because Ayatollah Burujerdi said, if you do this, I'm going to issue a fatwa against you. So I'm not sure, Maulana is a Muslim, considers himself a Muslim. Maulana is one of the most tolerant people, any poet that I know. He says, don't tell me you're a Jew, don't tell me you're a Christian. Meet me in the land of love. You know better than I do that there is a verse in the Quran that says there is no coercion in matters of faith. La ikraha fi din. But there is also a verse that says, Qatalu fi sabilillah, kill on the way of Allah. Islamism, as a hegemonic force, says, Qatalu fi sabilillah. Islamism as a matter of private faith, the Islam that I can assume from what I have read of you, that you might like, is the Islam that says, La ikraha fi din.
Yeah. So, oh, Santi, I'm curious because you mentioned that you're a Hispanic Catholic, and I wonder if there's a contrast that is relevant from your perspective that can give us some insight into some of these tensions, Islam and modernity, Islam and democracy. And I do want to make sure I want to make sure that we do return to the question of democracy, which we haven't focused as much on. I think we've focused more on liberalism and secularization. But I'm curious if you can say more about how you approach these issues
Yeah.
from a Catholic perspective.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because in any other context, Abbas and I would have nothing in common culturally, right? Except that we both are facing the United States as the hegemon of our time, right? And as the representative of modernity in some ways, right? As the empire that, for better for worse, is the protector of democracy. And in Latin America, the first of all, we didn't have theocracy like you have in Iran, so religion is not as problematic. But on the positive side, there has been this tradition of Catholic intellectuals who were not on the far right, but also not socialists and not secularists, who tried to there was Christian democratic parties. That's a big tradition in Western Europe and in Latin America, and even a little bit further left, there were Catholic socialists and liberation theologians that even formed coalitions with communists and Marxists. So I think that there's like a wider spectrum of possibility when it comes to having, political religion, for lack of a better word, and that it's not always incompatible with democracy. And why would you want political religion? And I think it's precisely to protect this sort of ambiguity that you're talking about, Professor. Because if you read even to the 19th century, the poets and critics in Latin America would lament North American influence, and they would associate North American influence with technology and secularism. And they would say, in Latin America, we're still in touch with nature and we're still in touch with God. And a lot of that is kind of BS, just like you yourself have said that a lot of the talk about Persian mysticism is also inaccurate. I'm aware of that. But it is true that we do want to preserve mysticism and God and ambiguity in modern society. And it is true that sort of like global homogenization, the global market, you used to be a Marxist. Like these things must echo somewhere in you, right? It is true that those things should be resisted. I don't want
I wasn't
McDonald's
a
everywhere.
Marxist. I have to correct you. I wasn't a Marxist. I was a Stalinist. I was worse.
Okay. So, okay. So you
Maoist.
know what I say? Look,
Even worse than a Stalinist. I was a Maoist.
so like, but the religion does preserve valuable things, right? And we want those in democracy, and so we want religion has a positive value to add to democracy.
Well, here I have to quote Dostoevsky, the Grand Inquisitor. I'm sure you
Yeah.
have read that. Uh, the function that is Marxism, Maoism, Stalinism provided for us, for our generation, is in a sense the same function that religion provides for the Islamist. It provides certitude against ambiguity. And in the Grand Inquisitor, since you're a Catholic thinker, Dostoevsky has the Grand Inquisitor telling Jesus Christ, you don't understand human beings. Human beings don't tolerate ambiguity. They don't want freedom. They want somebody to tell them what is good and bad, give them enough bread, and promise them salvation. Marxism does that. That's why it's called the opium of the masses, of the intellectuals.
Yeah, but Marx also has, it must appeal to your romantic side that you spoke about
Oh,
earlier, right?
absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
but that romantic side is not all bad. That's a good part of you.
Well, no, the romantic side is good.
And
There
how do
is
you
a
preserve
romantic
that?
side.
So
Yeah,
if
yeah,
you,
absolutely.
and what I
Abs-
think in Latin America, the last bulwark against technology and capitalism is Christian democracy. That's an exaggeration of the thesis, but I'm going to advance it here. So if you want to resist McDonald's, you need to have more religious parties.
I would say if you resist the McDonald with religious parties, you'll get worse than McDonald for your heart burn and your heart ache. You should resist McDonald by a sense of autonomous self that says, "Who the hell are you to try to tell me what to eat? Who the hell are you to try to tell me that has 1,000 years of cuisine behind me whether I should have kebab or McDonald?" I am autonomous culture. I have more history than you. I have the right to decide what I eat. I'm not going to let you homogenize me. I don't want to be homogenized. I want to preserve my cuisine, but if you have a good oven to sell me, I might buy it from you. You're not going to change my clothing. You're not going to change my language. uh, Islam doesn't do that. Islam, if you look at it, is the most hegemonic idea. It forces religion, language. It forces dress. It forces culture on Iran. It has tried to change every one of these things on Iran. Why is that not hegemonic? We should withstand all hegemonies, Eastern and Western, Chinese, Russian, American, German, and Arab. If they come and say, "You've got to speak my language, you got to dress like me." The Iranian clergy dress the way they think Muhammad dressed then.
But
Isn't that hegemony?
isn't there a risk that we're anthropomorphizing Islam a little bit?
That's it for part one, dear listeners. There's a lot more where that came from. If you're not yet a paying subscriber, please head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and become one. Help support our work. Hope to see you in the bonus.